We're here at Banneker. Let's recap. We've covered Loudoun County transportation from the 1870s to 1968, from segregation through integration. And throughout all that 100 years, one of the constants that remains is the ability for students to walk to their local schools. That didn't change, whether you were black or white. But in the early 1900s, Loudoun County Public Schools started employing what were called school hacks. These were horse-drawn carriages that carried students to schools. Now, this was in response to an act to consolidate white schools in Loudoun County. Smaller schools were closing. Their students had to be transported to larger schools. In 1925, the first motorized bus appeared in Loudoun County. Once again, this was just for whites. Blacks continued to walk to their schools, which were in some cases far off the beaten path and very remote. Now, those early school buses in the 20s were little more than the carriages from school hacks mounted on a motorized chassis. In 1937, 12 years after the first motorized school bus for whites appeared, blacks got a school bus. They got one. And it traveled to the Leesburg Training Center along a very narrow swath of Loudoun County. If you weren't in that swath, you had to get to the Leesburg Training Center some other way. In 1940, the addition of school buses for blacks increased, okay? And also in 1941, Douglas High School opened. It opened to only having one school bus for it, all right? But as we see, or as we learned, black parents did not let that keep them from getting their students to the high school. They would employ their own private transportation. As the school bus count increased in the 1940s, black schools were consolidated, all right? Banneker and Carver opened in 1948 as a result of that consolidation. Here at Banneker, schools like St. Louis and Willisville had 2 rooms, 2 teachers, and too many students. So they were being transported here to Banneker. In Carver, they had schools like Lovettsville and Hillsborough, whose student population dropped so low that it wasn't efficient to have a school in that location. So buses began transporting them to Carver. Another introduction in 1940s was that of the student school bus driver. These were high school students, normally in their junior and senior year, who would, in the mornings, pick up students, take them to their schools, go to class. In the evenings, after class, they would take the buses, retrieve those students, and drop them off at their locations. This continued through the 50s and into the 60s for both black and white student bus drivers. Now, in the early 1960s, integration began here in Loudoun County. Small at first, students attending places like Loudoun Valley High, and it increased through the 60s. Black student bus drivers began carrying students to white schools, but these were only black students. White drivers sometimes carried black students, but black drivers very rarely, or if at all, carried black students to these white schools. As integration continued, those black drivers now attending white schools were responsible for even more black students. An interesting thing was that as integration happened, the students in those white schools began joining their athletic teams. And regardless of race, for away games, everybody rode the same bus. Okay, we're coming up to 1968 and pretty much integration is fully underway. One of the things that I'd like to remark here is that petitions were used throughout the 20th century by both black and white parents to request things like school buses, improved road conditions, etc. 18% of the petitions the Edwin Washington Project found for black parents had to do with transportation. When I think about what black parents did using their private vehicles, their petitions, and I think about the phrase, "we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors," it seems spot on. I want to thank you for your attention and urge you to visit the Edwin Washington Project website for more detailed information, and look for our book, Dirt Don't Burn. Thank you.